The moment I heard Adrian's voice fill the hospital lounge, I knew he was performing. He always performed in front of people. He stood near the window where the afternoon light caught his profile just right, as if he had planned it that way. Family filled the small room, his mother, his 2 sisters, 3 cousins, and a family friend named Bernard who never missed a gathering. My own sister, Fiona, sat in the corner with her arms crossed, watching. The baby had just been cleaned and wrapped. I lay in the hospital bed barely 20 feet away, still shaking from the delivery. My body felt hollow. My hands were trembling. But Adrian's voice was smooth and full and proud. He held our daughter toward the ceiling like she was proof of something. "This little girl," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is proof that Elena finally proved herself to me." I closed my eyes. Not because I was tired, though I was. I closed them because I had heard that phrase before, proved herself, and I knew exactly what it meant to him. It meant he had won again. At least, he believed he had. Adrian could walk into any room and own it within 30 seconds. That was the first thing I noticed about him when we met at a company dinner 8 years ago. I was 27. He was charming and well-dressed, and everyone laughed at his jokes just a little too quickly. I thought at the time that it was admiration. I understand now that it was something closer to fear. He built his reputation carefully. He was seen as generous, always the one picking up the restaurant tab, always the one offering to help a colleague move apartments. Nobody saw the other side. They did not see how he came home and told me which of those same colleagues were liabilities. They did not see how he smiled at me in public and then spent entire evenings making me feel invisible in our own home. But in that hospital room, surrounded by people who adored him, Adrian was the perfect version of himself. He kissed the baby's forehead. He looked at me with big, soft eyes. His sister handed him a tissue as if he were overcome with emotion. I looked at the doorway instead, waiting for the doctor. 3 years into our marriage, I gave up a promotion. My manager at the time, a direct woman named Carla who had mentored me for 2 years, had offered me a regional director position. The salary would have doubled. I would have managed a team of 12. I turned it down because Adrian said the travel would put pressure on our marriage. He said it gently, with concern in his eyes. He held my hand while he said it. I believed him. I told Carla I needed to stay in my current role to focus on family. She looked at me for a long moment before nodding. Then I went home and started taking care of Adrian's mother, Doris, who had developed mobility problems and moved in with us 2 months later. Nobody asked if I was ready for that. It simply happened. I cooked her meals, drove her to appointments, and managed her medication schedule while also working full-time. I did not complain. I told myself that sacrifice was love. I told myself that Adrian appreciated it even when he did not say so. I was wrong on both counts, but I would not fully understand that for years. The rumors started in our 4th year of marriage. They did not come from strangers. They came from Adrian's own social circle, passed quietly from one person to another at dinners and birthday parties and group chats I was not included in. The story was always the same, that I had been distant, that I had old male friendships Adrian did not know about, that I had once disappeared for a weekend without explanation. None of it was true. But the way rumors work, truth is almost beside the point. What matters is repetition. By the time Adrian brought the story to me directly, it had already been polished smooth with retelling. He sat across from me at our kitchen table and asked me calmly if there was anything I wanted to tell him. His voice was level. His eyes were steady. He looked like a man being patient, not a man telling lies. I told him there was nothing to confess. He nodded slowly and said he was trying to trust me. He said it as if trust was a gift he was generously offering. I did not yet understand that he was the one who had started the rumors in the first place. We decided to try for a child after 2 years of the rumors and the silences and the careful dinners where we both pretended things were fine. The fertility process was long and painful and mostly mine to carry. I was the one who took the medications. I was the one who tracked the cycles and attended the early consultations alone because Adrian had work travel that he said could not be moved. He handled the paperwork. That was how he contributed, he said. He had a talent for organization and detail, and he was right about that. He managed our finances, our contracts, our legal documents. I trusted him completely with anything on paper. I signed forms he summarized for me without reading every page. I told myself it was division of labor. I told myself we were a team. Looking back now, I understand how dangerous it is to let one person hold all the documents while the other person holds all the hope. The dinner where everything shifted happened in our 6th year of marriage. Adrian's family had gathered at his sister Priya's house for his mother's birthday. There were 12 of us around the table. Halfway through the meal, Adrian made a toast. He raised his glass and smiled at Doris and said something warm about family. Then, without pausing, he turned to me and said, "And to Elena, who is still learning what it means to be fully trustworthy." There was a half-second of silence before everyone laughed. Not a cruel laugh, an uncomfortable one, the kind people produce when they do not know how else to respond. I smiled. I lifted my glass. I said nothing. Fiona, who had come as my guest, looked at me from across the table with her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open. I gave her a small shake of my head. Not here. Not now. I had learned to perform nearly as well as Adrian by then. But later that night, while he slept, I sat in the kitchen and noticed the corner of a document peeking out from his briefcase. I pulled it out. I saw my name on the header. And then I saw a figure next to a loan number that I had never agreed to. The debt was significant. I do not mean that loosely. When I finally laid everything out on the kitchen table 3 days later, the documents I had quietly photographed, the bank statements I had pulled from our shared account, the loan agreements I had finally read in full, the number was enough to take our home. Adrian had used our property as collateral for a series of investments that had not performed. He had restructured the loans twice. He had listed my name as co-borrower on 2 of them using signatures that did not match mine. I stared at those signatures for a long time. My name, but not my hand. I had a very specific way of writing the capital E in Elena, a small loop at the top that I had developed in secondary school. The signatures on those documents had no loop. Someone had practiced my name but not studied it carefully enough. I did not confront Adrian that night. I took photographs of everything instead. Then I put the documents back exactly where I had found them, went upstairs, and lay beside my husband in the dark while my mind began to move in a completely different direction. Fiona thought I was being too passive. She sat in my car outside a grocery store 2 weeks after I found the documents and told me directly that I needed to act. "Elena, you have proof," she said. "You have forged signatures. You have a paper trail. What are you waiting for?" I told her I was waiting to understand the full picture before I moved. She looked at me like I was surrendering. I understood why she saw it that way. From the outside, my stillness looked like giving up. But I had watched Adrian operate for 6 years by then, and I knew one thing clearly. He was at his most dangerous when he felt cornered. If I confronted him before I was fully prepared, he would move the assets, destroy the records, and tell everyone I had suffered a breakdown during the pregnancy. He had already been telling people I was emotionally unstable. I had heard it third-hand from Fiona herself. So instead of confronting him, I opened a private email account on my work laptop. And I started making calls, to the bank, to the fertility clinic, and eventually to a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Petra. She was small and quiet, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She did not express shock at anything I told her, which was the most reassuring thing about her. She listened to the full account, looked through the photographs I had printed, and then removed her glasses and set them on the desk. "The forged signatures alone are significant," she said. "But what concerns me more is the fertility documentation." I had not yet told her about the fertility records. I asked her what she meant. She said she had seen cases before where financial manipulation ran alongside medical manipulation, particularly in contested custody situations. She asked whether I had been the primary contact at the fertility clinic. I told her that Adrian had handled most of the administrative communication. She wrote something down and then looked at me over the edge of her notepad. "I want you to request a full copy of your medical file from that clinic," she said. "Your complete file, everything from the first consultation." I left her office with a new list and a new kind of dread settling into my stomach. When I was 7 months pregnant, Adrian placed a folder on the kitchen counter and told me we needed to update our legal arrangements before the baby came. He described it as standard. He said every couple with assets should have clear documentation in place, especially ahead of a new addition to the family. He went through the summary with me point by point while I sat at the counter eating an apple. His tone was warm and practical. He used words like protection and clarity and making sure you're covered. He did not tell me that the document gave him primary control over our shared financial accounts in any separation scenario. He did not tell me that the asset allocation clause would make it extremely difficult for me to access the equity in our home independently. I nodded along and told him I would look it over. He smiled and left the folder with a pen on top. That evening, I photographed every page and sent it to Petra. Her reply came back within an hour. 2 words. Do not sign. The fertility clinic was called ClearPath. I had been a patient there for 2 years during our treatment cycle. When I called to request my full records, the receptionist told me it would take 5 to 7 business days. I gave them my personal email and asked that nothing go to our home address. 7 days later, a file arrived. I opened it at my desk at work with my office door closed. The records were detailed: dates, procedures, medication protocols, consent forms. I went through each page slowly. Then I stopped at a consent form from our second treatment cycle. The authorization at the bottom carried my name and a date. But I had not signed any forms during that second cycle. Adrian had told me that particular appointment was administrative and that he would handle it. I had not been present. I pulled out my phone and looked at my calendar from that date. I had been at a work conference 3 cities away. I sat very still for a moment. Then I called Petra. "I think I need you to contact the clinic directly," I said. "There are authorization records that need to be reviewed by someone other than me." The isolation happened gradually and then all at once. By my 8th month of pregnancy, most of the friends Adrian and I had shared no longer reached out to me directly. The group dinners stopped including me. Invitations arrived addressed to Adrian alone. When I asked him about it once, he said gently that people felt uncomfortable around me lately, that I seemed withdrawn and unpredictable. He said he had tried to defend me but that he could only do so much. He said this with a tired, devoted expression, as if my behavior had become a burden he was heroically carrying. I had stopped arguing with his version of events by then. Instead, I documented them. I noted the dates of conversations. I kept every text message. I took a screenshot of a group chat Fiona accidentally forwarded to me in which Adrian had written that he was worried about my mental stability during the pregnancy. He had sent it to 8 people. I added it to the folder. He announced the baby shower, a large gathering at our home, his planning, his guest list, as a public gesture of his devotion to me. I smiled and thanked him. And I quietly called Petra to let her know the timeline was accelerating. I found the payment by accident. I had been looking for a receipt in Adrian's home office, something mundane, a warranty for the refrigerator, when I came across a printed bank statement he had left inside a magazine. The payment was listed as a transfer to a private medical administration account. The date aligned exactly with the second treatment cycle at ClearPath. The amount was not large. It was the kind of payment you could overlook if you were not specifically looking for something wrong. But I had been specifically looking for something wrong for months by then. I photographed it, added it to my growing folder, and sent it to Petra with a note. She replied the next morning and told me she had already been in contact with a patient records administrator at ClearPath. The administrator had flagged the consent form internally and was reviewing the authorization logs for that cycle. Petra used careful, precise language in her messages. But underneath the careful language, I understood what she was telling me. Someone had paid to access and alter medical records, and that someone had done it before we even knew whether the pregnancy would succeed. My labor started 3 weeks earlier than expected. I was at my desk at work when the contractions began, sharp and fast, nothing like the slow build I had been told to anticipate. Fiona drove me to the hospital because Adrian did not answer his phone for the first 40 minutes. He arrived an hour after I had already been admitted, slightly out of breath, wearing a jacket that was not the one he had left home in that morning. He took my hand and told me he had come as fast as he could. He said it in front of the nurse, which I noticed. I focused on the delivery. I focused on breathing and on the sound of the machines and on getting through each wave of pain. At some point in the middle of it, a nurse came in and looked at my chart and then looked at a second form she was holding. She frowned very slightly. It was the kind of frown that a person makes when they are deciding whether to say something. She set the second form aside without comment and went to speak quietly with a colleague near the door. I watched her go. I filed that small moment away in my mind. Our daughter arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon. She was small and loud and absolutely perfect. For about 20 minutes, I let myself simply exist in that fact. Fiona cried. Even the nurse who had been with us longest smiled broadly. Adrian held the baby and looked at the phone he used to take photos more than he looked at me, but I let that go too. For those 20 minutes, I was just a mother who had just met her daughter. Then Adrian's family arrived in a wave. His mother came in first, then Priya, then the cousins, then Bernard. The room filled with noise and warmth and congratulations aimed mostly at Adrian. He stood at the center of it, passing the baby around, narrating the story of the delivery with himself as the steady, devoted anchor of the whole event. He showed people photos he had taken. He accepted embraces. And then he made his speech about loyalty and proof, and I watched the room absorb his words, and I thought, not long now. The doctor was still in the building. And Petra had confirmed that morning that she would be at the hospital by 6. Dr. Namdi had been my attending physician for the final trimester. He was quiet and thorough, and he had a habit of reading documents the way a person reads something that does not quite add up. Slowly, with small pauses. When he walked into the lounge carrying a manila folder, the room did not immediately go quiet. People were still talking, still passing the baby. But then he stopped near the window and opened the folder and read something, and then read it again, and the quality of his stillness made the nearest conversations slow down on their own. Adrian noticed. I watched Adrian notice. His smile did not disappear, but it tightened at the edges the way a mask tightens when the face underneath it changes expression. Dr. Namdi looked up and said, in a voice that carried without being loud, I need to clarify something about the patient's file before we proceed with the discharge documentation. Adrian asked what the issue was. The doctor said calmly that the consent authorization logs for certain reproductive records did not match the hospital's verification system. Who authorized the transfer of these records? He asked. The room went very quiet. The family attorney, Adrian's family attorney, a man named Clifford whom I had met twice at formal occasions, arrived at 10 minutes past 6. He had been called by Adrian earlier that day, ostensibly to finalize the post-birth legal documents I had never signed. He walked in carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expression of professional calm. He did not expect to find Petra already seated in the room's corner chair, her reading glasses on her nose and a folder of her own open on her lap. Adrian looked at Petra and then at me, and something shifted in his face. Not panic, not yet, but a careful recalibration, the way a person recalculates a route when they realize the road ahead is blocked. Elena, he said. Who is this? I told him Petra was my attorney. He said he did not know I had retained an attorney. I said there were a number of things he did not know. The baby was in Fiona's arms. Doris sat very still near the window. Priya had stopped typing on her phone. Clifford looked between Adrian and Petra and then set his briefcase down without opening it. Dr. Namdi did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. He explained in measured terms that the hospital's reproductive records department had flagged a discrepancy in consent documentation connected to my file. He said an administrative review had been initiated 2 weeks prior. Initiated, he said carefully, following a request from a patient records inquiry. He said the authorization logs showed that certain documents had been accessed and modified using credentials that did not match the patient's primary login. He laid the folder open on the side table so that it could be seen without being touched. Adrian interrupted twice. The first time, he said there must be a technical error. The second time, he said he had always managed the family's medical paperwork on Elena's behalf, and that this was a normal arrangement. Dr. Namdi nodded politely after each interruption and then continued. When he finished, Priya turned to Adrian and asked, very quietly, what he had done. Adrian did not answer her. He looked at me instead. And for the first time since the day we met, he did not look like a man who knew what the next move was. I told the story from the beginning. Not all of it. There was not enough time and this was not a courtroom. But enough. I talked about the fertility paperwork. I talked about the consent form signed on a day I was 3 cities away. I talked about the forged signatures on the loan documents and the payment that traced back to a medical administration account. I talked about the post-birth legal documents I had not signed and what they would have meant for my financial independence. I spoke in the same steady voice I had practiced using during the years when Adrian made jokes about me at dinner tables, and I smiled and said nothing. His family listened. I watched his mother's face change as I spoke, not with anger, but with a slow, exhausted recognition, like a person who has suspected something for a long time and is finally hearing it confirmed. Bernard left the room quietly. The cousins stopped moving. Clifford stood near the door with his briefcase in his hand and said nothing. When I finished, Petra placed a single page on the table and said, I also need to note that there are 3 additional documents ready for signature, Elena's signature, regarding asset protection. Adrian's composure broke slowly, then completely. It started with his voice, a slight elevation in pitch when he said my name. Then his hands, which he pressed flat against his thighs as if steadying himself. Then the words came out wrong, tumbling over each other in a way his words never did in public. He said that I had always been jealous of his relationships with people. He said I had manufactured a version of events that made him look like a villain. He said the documents were misread, the signatures were legitimate, the fertility records were being taken out of context. He turned to his mother and asked her to tell everyone what kind of wife I had been. Doris did not respond. She looked at the floor. Adrian turned to Priya and began again. Priya said, Adrian, stop talking. He stopped. Not because he wanted to. I could see that he was not finished. He stopped because the room had closed around him. There was no audience left. There was nobody performing the role of the sympathetic witness. And without an audience, Adrian did not know how to exist. What surprised people most was not the documents or the legal filings or even the medical revelation. What surprised them was how organized I was. Petra set out a binder on the table, a physical binder, tabbed and dated, that contained 12 months of records. Financial statements. Photographs of documents. Printed emails. Clinic communications. Attorney correspondence. A timeline beginning from the first forged signature and ending with the administrative flag at the hospital 2 weeks prior. Clifford looked at the binder for a long moment and then sat down. Adrian's cousin, a young man named Roland who had always laughed the loudest at Adrian's jokes, asked quietly if I had been preparing this the entire time. I said I had been paying attention the entire time. There is a difference, I explained, between preparing an attack and protecting yourself from one. Adrian had been preparing something for years. I had simply begun, at a certain point, to prepare something better. The asset protection documents Petra had ready meant that the home equity Adrian had tried to redirect was already secured in my name. His transfer attempt, filed 3 days before the birth, had failed. The room did not erupt. There was no dramatic confrontation. It deflated, the way a room deflates when the main thing holding it together turns out to be false. Priya told Adrian to call their family's private attorney in the morning. Bernard did not come back in. The cousins gathered their coats. Roland paused at the door and looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Elena." I thanked him. Doris stayed. When the room was mostly empty, she came and sat beside my bed and held my hand and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "He told me things about you that I repeated to people. I didn't ask if they were true. I told her I knew." She nodded and was quiet again. She looked at the baby, who had been settled back into my arms by then. "She looks like you," Doris said. I said I hoped that was a good thing. She smiled, very slightly. "It is," she said. It was the first genuine exchange Doris and I had in 2 years. I held it carefully, the way you hold something small and fragile and unexpectedly true. The legal and financial consequences unfolded over the following weeks with a kind of steady, implacable logic. The forged signatures triggered a formal fraud investigation. The fertility clinic completed its internal review and submitted findings to both the hospital board and the relevant regulatory office. 3 of the loan accounts were frozen pending an audit. The post-birth documents Adrian had prepared were set aside entirely. Clifford withdrew from the matter and Adrian retained new representation, though the position he was starting from was not a strong one. Petra told me, at our meeting 3 weeks after the birth, that the asset protections we had filed were holding. The house remained mine. The primary accounts remained mine. The equity Adrian had tried to redirect was back in my name. She said it matter-of-factly, like a woman describing a satisfying piece of work. I asked her what my next steps were. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk and said, "Your next step is to go home and take care of your daughter." I laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I had produced in months, and it surprised me with how good it felt. On the morning I left the hospital, I sat in the discharge room alone for a few minutes while Fiona went to bring the car around. The baby was strapped into the carrier, quiet and warm against my chest. There was an envelope on the small table beside me. Adrian had left it with the nurse the evening before and asked her to give it to me in the morning. I had known it was coming. He had sent 3 messages the night before that I had not answered, each one progressively less steady than the last. The final one had ended with the words, "Please read the letter." I sat in the discharge room and I held the envelope and I thought about what was probably inside it. The explanation that reframed everything. The apology worded to minimize rather than accept. The appeal to what we had built together, as if what we had built was a home and not a performance. I placed the envelope in my bag without opening it. Maybe I would read it later. Maybe I would not. I had spent enough years reading between Adrian's lines. I had the rest of my life to read things that were true. 4 months later, I went back to work. Carla had moved on to a different company, but the colleague who replaced her remembered me and reached out when a senior position opened on her team. I took it. It was not the regional director role I had turned down years earlier, but it was something I had chosen freely and on my own terms, which made it feel larger. My daughter's name is Iris. She is small and loud and curious, and she looks at everything in the world like it deserves to be examined. Fiona comes over on Sunday mornings and we drink coffee while Iris conducts her investigations of the living room floor. Doris calls twice a week to check in. She never mentions Adrian unless I bring him up, which I rarely do. I am not free of the hard parts. There are still court dates and paperwork and moments in the evenings when I sit with a cup of tea and feel the weight of the years I spent making myself smaller so that someone else could feel large. But there is something underneath the weight now. Something that was always there but that I could not feel properly until I stopped carrying everything else. It is the simple, solid knowledge that I am standing on ground that belongs to me. And nobody, not ever again, is going to take it.